Welcome to Second Table, where we discuss spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. I'm your host, Winston Janis. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Second Table. Today, I'm here with Matt Carricker. And Matt Carricker is an ordained UCC pastor at Agape Spiritual Community in Waltham, Massachusetts. And he's also a Protestant chaplain at Brandeis University. He's also an author, a spiritual coach, retreat leader. And I think you're working on a book right now. Is that right, Matt?
That's right. Yeah. Giving Christianity back to agape love.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any idea when that's going to be coming out?
Hopefully soon. I'm working with it'll be self-published, but we're just working with the publisher to finalize the manuscript now, and so hopefully, maybe within 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's exciting. I remember, just to give a little bit of context, right? I was interested in the possibility of what it might look like to start a new church community, a new church start within the UCC. So I got in touch with some people in the UCC, Don Remick and some others, right? And I was telling them about some of my ideas, and they said, after having talked to me a little bit and gotten to know me, they said, you should connect with Matt Carricker, right? So I think, not because this is a new church start that you were present with from the ground up, Agape Spiritual Community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was also, there's a connection. I don't know. I can't remember if they picked up on this, but I know we definitely talked about it. Was our both shared kind of interest in both the Christian tradition and the Buddhist tradition, right? Mindfulness and contemplative practices and all that stuff. So yeah, I'd love to talk with you about sort of both of those things. I mean, I don't know, we could go with any direction, right? But I don't know if you wanted to tell people a little bit about your church, or your spiritual community rather, right? However you want, whatever term people are comfortable with, right? Agape Spiritual Community. I don't know if you want to tell people a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so agape is a Greek word that means unconditional love. So that's kind of our central identity, is living into that. It's not like we don't even have members. We have what we call vision partners. And so, membership sometimes feels like an exclusive country club, whereas vision partner feels like, if you resonate with this vision and want to help unfold this vision of a community committed to living out and embodying agape love, then join us. And so there's not like feels like a lot of churches or spiritual communities are kind of a checklist of beliefs. Like you got to check off all these beliefs. And we're less about, here are these beliefs that you have to subscribe to, and more like, hey, if this vision of living into agape love that Jesus modeled and that is who God is, then, we'd love to have you join us. And, we're pretty open, and you could say progressive. I mean, we're open and affirming of whether you're LGBTQIA, which really try to create like a multicultural, multiracial community, which I think is kind of rare nowadays, since Sundays are still a pretty segregated time for churches. And and I think we're also pretty unique in kind of being, you might call it a pluralistic kind of Christian congregation, so centered on Jesus, but still drawing off of the wisdom from other spiritual religious traditions rooted in love. And that's, I know, something we both have in common of, having had formational experiences with Buddhism and Christianity. And
right.
So it's sweet. We're still a fairly new church start, almost 5 years old, but it's a really sweet, welcoming community that really seeks to live out that unconditional love as our core identity.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
I mean, I was looking at because one of the aims of this podcast, one of the reasons why I want to do this, is because, as we all know, there are certain dominant voices within Christianity. And, you know, I was looking at a few of your posts on, as I was kind of, you know, just trying to get a little familiar with what your online presence here. You have some posts you made on Huffington Post, right? And,
Sure.
yeah, you wrote about just that the popular perception of Christianity, right? There's it's all about beliefs and outdated beliefs, and you were kind of saying people see it as this set of outdated beliefs, and in a way, they're right. They're right because there's been a lot of damaging history, harmful history within the Christian tradition, and so once again, kind of returning to part of the reason why I'm doing this is to offer an alternative voice and to introduce alternative voices like yourself that give a different perspective of the Christian tradition, and say, you know, that we don't necessarily have to discard the whole thing. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, that there is something worth hanging on to here. There is something that we can live into that's truly authentic, spiritually, intellectually, and in all these different ways. And I feel like that's part of what your work is as well, and what you're doing. You know, like when I'm looking at your Agape's website, your church, you know, core beliefs. One of the things I appreciate is that you are kind of saying a lot of things pretty explicitly. Whereas I think you know, you look at some church websites and they say like the UCC statement of faith. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but I feel like for some people who are have only been exposed to very fundamentalist or conservative versions of Christianity, right. They might look at even the UCC statement of faith and say, well, that's not for me. I just don't believe that stuff. Right. So in a way, I feel like it's important for, you know, Christian, whether you want to call us progressive Christians or whatever term you want to use, to be a little bit more also bold and kind of clear and explicit about, hey, there's a different approach that maybe we're taking than the popular approach. Like you write, the Bible is inspired but not infallible. That Jesus is not the only way to salvation. I'm reading from your website here right now. You know, original blessing rather than original sin, etc. You know? Yeah. And, you know, it feels like there's a real need to be explicit about that because so many people have been hurt by, you know, it's not that people are often it's really warm-hearted, loving, faithful people, but one of my friends put it this way. He said, warm heart, chilly theology, you know, where you might have really loving people, but when you kind of look underneath the theology of what they might believe, there's like, oh, that doesn't really speak very well of God. Like, you know, yeah. When you start really thinking about it. Right.
Yeah. It doesn't point to a God of like agape love. That's, at least when I look at Jesus, that's the kind of God that I see him pointing to, you know, in parables like the prodigal son, where it's like, it's pretty clear, like that's a love that's without conditions and without boundaries. And too often the church has been more conditional love and very judgmental. And, and, you know, I feel like, you know, you could also you certainly use the word progressive, but even like emerging, you know, emerging church, like, right. You know, we were talking earlier about philistical and, you know, the 500 year, you know, kind of
rummage sale,
rummage sale, you know, and that we're in one of those times. And so it's really being less connected to still maintaining the essence, because love is the essence. That's what Jesus said, you know, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you'll love your neighbor as yourself. But in a way, the forms aren't as important of how that looks like. You know, I mean, we're often gathering in the Intercultural Center of Brandeis on couches in a total non-church-like space, and some things we do look churchy and some don't. But you know, that's where I see, you know, Jesus's wisdom of it. It's more about the essence, which is love, than the forms, whether that be traditions and how you do your service or the beliefs. So I think that's,
Yeah,
you know,
I think the rummage thing, the rummage sale thing, that happens every 500 years. The Phyllis Tickle said that. I think that's worth highlighting, so that maybe people who are curious about that listening here, the idea that every 500 years, when we look back, there's been major transitions within the movement of Christianity. Actually, even I think when I heard on a video Phyllis Tickle talking about it, actually precedes Christianity. This goes back to the Jewish tradition and the exile into Babylon and all those things, the destruction of the temple. So every 500 years, there's this massive movement. And who knows why, that 500-year mark, right? But that we are maybe in a one of those transitions right now, a major transition in the church, but also in our understanding of ourselves, of our theology, of what it means to be human, what our relationship is to God or the universe. And in other words, I see it as a kind of progression or evolution towards something that is not always clear in the moment, but that the things are kind of evolving and we're participating in that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's I mean, one of my favorite quotes from that book, The Great Emergence, is when Phyllis Tickle quotes Anglican Bishop Mark Dyer when he says, every 500 years the church feels compelled to hold a giant rummage sale. The church is like this. It's like this giant carapace, like a hard shell that has to be shattered in order for renewal and new growth to occur. And in a sense, it feels like that's kind of what's happening in the church right now. Is that these old traditions that no longer serve us. There's a lot of. I feel like there's a lot of grief in traditional churches with people like, oh, where are the people? Why aren't they coming? And the young people are like, they're off, having fun on Sundays, and not really too concerned about it. They're getting spiritually felt elsewhere, and places like the How We Gather program at Harvard Divinity School are looking at different ways that younger folks are gathering, but it's this emerging sense that the form isn't as important as that people are looking to like love God, love their neighbor, and love themselves, and whether it's like retreats or service experiences, people are looking outside like traditional church boundaries, and so. It's so important to try to find new creative ways of like, how do we gather people in community in ways that are life-giving? And for me, part of it, what if emerging spiritual community feels like it's more about practice. We want to find practices that are life-giving rather than, kind of static. There's that quote that I really like from seminary that tradition is the living faith of the dead and the dead faith of the living.
Say that one more time.
Tradition is the living faith of the dead and the dead faith of the living.
Yeah.
So
right.
Like at one point it may have been life-giving for people and they've passed on, and we, many churches are just carrying on these traditions that maybe life-giving at one point, but now we're just like, oh, why are you doing that? Well, we've always done it that way before.
Yeah. And now it's kind of like our turn to own it and to make it our own in some sense. Right.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think this is a really important question, right? I mean, this is a big theme in a way of this podcast. I mean, I've said it's about discussion about spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. But Second Table, the name, we don't have to get into it now. But in the first episode, I kind of described there's a parable that it's based off of, and that parable is all about altruism and community and feeding one another. And that's something that I think is missing to a large degree from our society today. So it is a really interesting question. And I think the next thing I was going to say, I'm losing my train of thought, but go ahead.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's part of why people are so drawn to Buddhism nowadays, because they don't see those. I mean, Buddhism and Christianity, neither are perfect. There's no perfect community, but it often doesn't have those constricting traditions and structures. Like, you you think of Buddhism, you think, oh, I'm going to go to the Zen center and meditate, and so it feels much more practice centered than belief centered.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was your experience with it, but that was, I first really encountered contemplative practices and meditation, through Buddhism and like Thich Nhat Hanh, and that's
absolutely
was my entree, into more Christian contemplative practices too.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. That it's not about an obligation. It's about, okay, this stuff is here to really serve our well-being as human beings, and it's validated by science, which is something that is really important, I think, to us culturally as a society here living in 2020. We want to, we respect science to a large extent. A lot of us do.
Yeah. Yeah, and in a week, I'm going to be starting at Agape a 4-part series on the art and science of meditation, according to Paramahansa Yogananda, who was really the first Indian, yogi to come to the U.S. in 1920, so 100 years ago.
Wow.
And he lived here until 1952. And he was really big about bridging East and West. He talked about bringing a scientific approach to religion. So, my own spirituality not only draws off of my Christian roots because I grew up in the church, but I've, also been practicing met Thich Nhat Hanh first time in 2003. And then I've been practicing Kriya Yoga in that tradition of Yogananda since 2006. And those are really life-giving for me. They complement who I am as a Christian minister. And it sounds like it's been similar for your journey too.
Yeah. So wait, did you say you met Thich Nhat Hanh?
I did.
Wow.
I mean, not just like we had like an intimate dinner together. This was a 5-day retreat at Stonehill College in summer of 2003. Yeah. But yeah, it was a powerful,
And for our listeners, Thich Nhat Hanh is one of the best known Zen Buddhist teachers. Probably, I think it went somewhere I saw he's like second to only the Dalai Lama, right? He's a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist mindfulness teacher, very prolific author and teacher of he's a walking mindfulness person. I don't know how else to put it. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so a lot of contemporary people call him like a living Buddha, because he just lives out, one of the titles.
Yeah. And he was nominated by Martin Luther King for the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's pretty old. He's he's almost 100, I think. And, so he was friends with Thomas Merton and Martin Luther King and all these great people,
Yeah, no, and it was, one of the things that always, I love hearing, Thomas Merton says that one of the things that inspired him about being with Thich Nhat Hanh is just like something as simple as the way he opened and closed the door. Just that mindfulness that he brought it to everything. And that's, when I first saw him at Stonehill College with 1,000 other people, it was that same feeling. Like just when he walked into the room, that presence, it was like he was peace. And that was the fruit of decades and generations of practice as a monastic. So a lot of people would probably be like, well, I don't have the time to do that kind of amount of practice, but yeah, he just radiates this peace that my first reaction to that retreat was like, I want what he's got.
Right.
And so I was able to be on one other retreat with him just for a day long in New York City once. And it so catalyzed my own individual practice. I think for me, it spoke to the necessity of trying to find supportive spiritual community, because it's, it's not that it's impossible to do it on our own, but it's helpful to have like-minded people and communities that kind of fill our cup, as opposed to just doing all our spiritual practices in isolation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, maybe that kind of is a lead into the question of, which maybe in some ways you're answering this already, but the issue of identity struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I've gone through, and I was curious to ask to what extent maybe you've gone through this as well, so that as someone who has gone through different phases of identifying as Christian, not identifying as Christian, identifying as Buddhist, identifying as Buddhist and Christian, right? That we're once again we're living in an increasingly pluralistic and interconnected world, and some people say, no way, can't be a Christian and a Buddhist at the same time. They're mutually exclusive, right? So I think a lot of people struggle with that. Probably, I'm sure there's a lot of people in our boat who have, found value and benefited from what they've learned about Buddhism, and so they say, okay, I'm just gonna totally disidentify from Christianity and go with Buddhism or whatever. So I don't know if you can speak to that at all, if you've had like an identity struggle in that way.
Yeah, for sure. I think so. Right after college, I did the Jesuit Volunteer Corps for almost 3 years, 2 years in Belize and a year in Haiti. And even though I wasn't Catholic, they welcomed me. And, so it was right after that. It was in between my second and third year with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps that I had that retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh. And, it was going through this conflict in my mind, because in 2002 I started to feel that call towards seminary. Because I was really becoming passionate about spirituality and faith, and finding a lot of really life-giving sources within Christianity, but then finding this amazing living teacher, like a teacher who was really living peace more so than any teacher within churches that I had found.
Right.
So I mean, this is again, 17, 18 years ago, but myself back then was like, well, how do I reconcile these two? Like, do I have to choose between either or? And really struggle with that, and struggle with do I stay in the church? Can I have multiple religious belonging? Should I become a Unitarian Universalist?
Yeah, I went through that too. Yeah.
Yeah. And, the first church I served was both the United Church of Christ and UU. So, it was an interesting mix, but, but I think what led me to stick with the United Church of Christ, as opposed to going over to the UUs or becoming Buddhist, was, I just felt such a strong connection with Jesus that I felt like I'd be losing something, because I knew UU ministers who went and served churches, and they're like, oh man, you can't even mention Jesus' name, because people who've been hurt by church. And so I felt like, for my own spiritual nourishment, I wanted Jesus. I didn't want the Jesus that had been co-opted by the religious right that was, more judgmental and all those negative associations, but the Jesus who was kind of like Thich Nhat Hanh, who embodied this way of peace and love to such a degree that, he inspired thousands, and after that millions. It was exponential. And and over the years I've come to this place of what I would call interspiritual. So even though I've been ordained in the United Church of Christ, and when I was going through the ordination process, I had some more orthodox religious people who were scolding their fingers and but I think having other people who modeled it, so for example, I actually haven't finished reading the book, but one of my favorite books is called A Mystic's Heart by Wayne Teasdale, where he talks about this term interspiritual, where he was kind of a Catholic monk, but still had this multiple religious belonging. And I mean, I see it, having been at Brandeis almost 8 years now as Protestant chaplain. It's so many people, so many students that I've talked to have a multiple religious belonging of maybe their parents had two different religious identities, and so they've had to struggle with that, or there's just so many variations of that. And so for me, that interspiritual word means, you may be rooted in one tradition. So for me, that's Christian, but still not being exclusive. You can still draw off the wisdom practices of other faith traditions. And so for me, that, Thich Nhat Hanh and Paramahansa Yogananda, or Hafiz and Rumi, who are Sufi poets, and, just all these different spiritual resources. And why, I think of what Jesus said in the gospel, which is, if they're not against us, they're not, they're for us. The disciples are like, they're not with us. And I feel like a lot of Christians are like that too. Oh, they're not Christians, so can't do that. And it feels like even a generation ago, people were like, oh, don't we can't do yoga in churches. And now there's a yoga studio everywhere, every street corner, and people are realizing, oh, that's kind of an embodied form of spirituality. Why don't we incorporate more of these embodied forms? And
yeah, it's like, oh, it almost makes me think of like how, as human beings, I think that there's a part of us that really wants clarity, that we want things to be sort of black and white. We want certainty. And when we introduce pluralism and dual religious belonging, which in a way are inevitable, right? Because we're, once again, living in this interconnected world and international travel and the internet, and we're all, getting so much more exposed to each other than we did 100 years ago or longer. So what do you have? It introduces ambiguity in a way. It introduces a kind of grayness, right?
Right. Yeah. And, a lot of people, I think, appreciate just the black and white, and, a lot of people want directions over choice. It's like, just tell me what to do, pastor, just tell me what to believe. And that's fine. Some people, that's, they're just in that space. But I think at least that's one piece that I value within the UCC, at least at a national level. It's, it's about living into the questions and, rather than there's God equally present in you as in me and in the entire congregation. So rather than just one leader or pastor kind of dictate what other people should believe or do, let's work this out together,
Right. We're all on this search, and there's a community aspect to that, but there's also this individual aspect to that we're all in this individual journey. One of the things I appreciated when I was looking at, I think, I don't know if one of your websites or one of your posts, the need to, no matter what we believe, to hold our beliefs lightly. I think that was an important thing to state, because, that's one of the things is we have to be careful, because I think, I recently talked with Peter Rollins, and one of his big things is looking at Christianity through the lens that it's really about breaking the scapegoat mechanism. That's what Christianity is about, is breaking down this thing of blaming the other person, blaming the other side, the them, right? It's us versus them. And it's true. I think that is a great way to conceptualize Christianity, because Jesus was always, as I heard Richard Rohr saying, Jesus is always making the other or the outsider the hero of the story. And that is, I think, what Christianity is about. And so how do we, this is probably going to be an ongoing question, I imagine, in this podcast, is how do we avoid falling into that same trap of scapegoating? Because it's easy to be like, oh, we're the progressive Christians that, have it right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. And I feel like that's part of our growing edge as more progressive Christians, is we, and for myself too, like an intolerance of intolerance. How can I, trying to live out that one of my favorite prayers of, in essentials unity, and non-essentials diversity, and all things charity. So, that gets to what's essential, what's non-essential. But at least when I look at Jesus's life, he had some of his strongest words for the religious authorities that were, I think, holding their beliefs a little too tightly.
Yeah.
And so much so that they were maybe hurting or oppressing other people. And so, especially as religious leaders today, and at least if you look at Christian history, it feels like that's where a lot of violence has been, perpetuated in Christ's name, where people are like, this is the way and I'm right and follow my way, or it's the highway, or see you later. And so not to hold our beliefs lightly, but to kind of, as Brian McLaren talks about in The Great Spiritual Migration, like that moving towards this dynamic pursuit of love, and to let that be and ground and center everything we do. So like, even with our beliefs, like I try to ask myself, does this belief align with love?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like one of the chapters, different chapters in my book, one about, substitutionary atonement theology, and like, does that belief align with love? I
Yeah.
don't know. So
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And God, I mean, we could go in so many directions. We could talk about that. But one of the things that brings up for me is like when I was going through my own sort of identity struggle, am I Christian or am I Buddhist? I think we've maybe talked about Jack Kornfield a little bit, right? Are you familiar with Jack Kornfield? I can't remember.
yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
and he's one of my favorite teachers as well. And I remember just thinking, listening to Jack Kornfield, because I think for me, this is, I don't know if he would characterize himself in this way, but for me, Jack Kornfield is all about articulating Buddhism as a path of the heart. Right. I mean, I think he's got a book by that title, right? The Path of the Heart or something like that.
Yeah.
And he's always telling these stories that you can't listen to without crying, and he's really good. It's not an intellectual thing really for Jack Kornfield. I don't think it's really about getting into your heart space. And so, he's so focused on compassion and love and seeing that we're not separate from one another. And to me, it's like, well, that's Christianity. If Christianity is anything, it's a path of the heart.
Right.
It's a path of love. It's a path of washing the feet of your neighbors, kind of thing. It's like, that's what Jesus embodied, was getting lost in love, Yeah. So I guess that brings us to the next question in a way, right? Is what maybe we can talk a little bit about is what then, if we know, because in a way, I think most people on some level know that we're supposed to be loving. We're supposed to be kind. It's amazing how bad we are at living that out as human beings, right? But then, so the question is, what makes, and this I think will be maybe another ongoing question of the podcast. Maybe I'll ask this to all my guests, right? So then what makes transformation possible? If we know that we're supposed to love, well, how, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's not a monocausal thing. It's not like there's one answer and like, you do that and then you love. It feels like there's so many answers, but I mean, part of it feels like there's the releasing component, because there's kind of letting go of what we don't need, like that story about, it's actually a Buddhist story about, the scholar who comes to I think it's a Zen monk and comes to learn from the Zen monk, and the scholar just keeps, basically telling the Zen monk all about these different scriptures, and eventually the monk starts pouring tea into the guy's cup, and the cup starts like overflowing, and the scholar's like, "What are you doing? The cup's full. You can't fit any more in the cup." And the Zen monk's like, "Well, you're like this cup. You're full, and I can't teach you anything until you empty your cup."
Right.
And I feel like many of us are like that we have all these beliefs and habits and patterns that we need to release in order to create space for ourselves. At least that's part of how I see spiritual practice, is letting go and releasing all those things that don't serve me anymore. Because there's plenty of things. And so part of that, it's not like a quick fix. There's like, therapy and spiritual coaching and spiritual counseling and spiritual direction and spiritual companionship. There's all these different ways, spiritual practices to release that. But then the counterpart of that is, how do I integrate these new practices? So I'm letting go of the old, but then how do I integrate the new? And, it feels like there's, kind of like a three-legged stool is the metaphor I like to think about it, in terms of really beginning to embody that transformed life of like, certainly like, our individual spiritual practices or communal spiritual practices, like whether that's meditation, prayer, journaling, yoga, etc. But then being with others in community, life-giving community and practices in community. But then the third piece, which is essential, is how do I go and serve others? Because I feel like that piece that we receive from God or the Holy Spirit or the universe or whatever you want to call it, it doesn't spread unless we share it. And so, however we're called to share love, be peace, serve others, make a difference, be a blessing in the world, like that's an essential piece too. Because if we just feel like, oh man, that was such a great meditation, I'm just gonna keep it to myself, and that there part of our calling in life is to go out and share whatever blessing we've received with others. So I think, and that takes practice, because it's really, we have these habits that have formed over years, and if you believe in reincarnation like I do, then probably many lifetimes.
Okay.
So we've got these that could be a whole nother sidetrack, but
yeah, let's do it.
But how do you sometimes one metaphor I like is like a magnet. A magnet that's not magnetized is like going in all these different directions, and often the easiest way to get a magnet to magnetize is put another magnet that is magnetized near it. And so that's kind of like the guru or the teacher. And
okay,
like
cool.
that's whether that's Jesus or Buddha, like someone who lives that way.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple things there, right? Like I actually, when I wrote this down, this quote, when I took it from your one of your articles that I really appreciated and I liked. Working for peace in the world isn't separate from inner peace work. Yeah, so that exactly, that we need to work on ourselves, and then as a byproduct, that will manifest changes in how we act and are in the rest of the world. It reverberates out, and I think that's so very Thich Nhat Hanh, right? That he's talking about being and our quality of being matters more than just the actions we take. Because if we're taking action in a very stressed or whatever way, that we're going to pass on that energy to other people. It's contagious in a way, as they say. If you can sense the energy in a room, and so people sense our own energy. Like you talked about when Thich Nhat Hanh walked in the room. I mean, that was like a decisive, that was like something that determined, in some sense, your spiritual journey. It sounded like just being in the presence of this person. So it's exactly what you're talking about. But I mean, I think for me, how do we love? I think part of it is learning to not. It's not. I think this has been maybe the popular perception that hasn't worked. Right? Is like, well, I just have to be determined and use willpower. Right? But I think that maybe there's something to that. But I really think that something like Thich Nhat Hanh would say, or Alan Watts would say. I'm probably going to end up bringing Alan Watts up in every single podcast episode, but that it's about changing the way you see reality, that once you see it differently, that automatically is going to change. I mean, I'm almost trying to think if I can think of an analogy for that, but it's like, it's like if you're dreaming, right? And you're terrified, it's a nightmare. Oh my God, there's monsters chasing me. And it's horrifying. Well, because you believe it's real. But then once you realize, like we sometimes do, oh, wait a second, I'm dreaming. Then all of a sudden, that one insight changes the way you relate to everything in the dream. All of a sudden, nothing is threatening anymore. And the other thing I think that you touched on too is just saying, once again, it comes back to practice, and that's something that I've heard from Thich Nhat Hanh, and that I've also appreciated. It's like that it's about we all have seeds within us, just like a garden, and there's a seed of anger, there's a seed of depression, there's a seed of happiness and joy and peace and contentment, etc. And to some extent, it really is a matter of water. Which seeds are you going to water? And
sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
Oh gosh, Siri's thinking I'm talking to her with seeds and stuff that I'm saying. But But that, what's interesting about that is that is exactly, but it sounds so simplistic. It almost sounds like, oh, positive thinking, right? If I do positive thinking,
Right.
then it kind of sounds like, okay, very, I don't know what the word is for that, right? Kind of cliche, or I don't know. I can't think of the word right now, but actually that's in line with neuroscience. So,
Right.
Neuroplasticity. I don't know. Have you been exposed much to like Dan Siegel's work by any chance?
A little bit. A little bit.
Yeah, he's this interpersonal neurobiologist. I think is his preferred title or whatever. But he's his thing is to a large degree the science behind mindfulness and neuroplasticity and how actually our brain changes throughout the lifespan. And they find that when they study people's brains who practice mindfulness, that actually their brains do change in response to meditation practices, and that basically it's like whatever neural pathways you use more frequently, whether that's the neural pathways of fear, right? Like if you're constantly activating this state within yourself, which I'm not trying to put the total, nobody wants to be in anxiety. I just want to make that clear. Like nobody is, oh, I want to be depressed today. I understand that. I've gone through panic attacks and stuff like that myself. And I realize that how horrible that can be, but that we sometimes get into a vicious circle. And that, so once you are repeatedly activating the neural circuitry around the amygdala, right, that that neural firing pattern strengthens, so that you're more likely to get into that spiral the next time. And the reverse, I think, is true, and that's, I think, what Thich Nhat Hanh and others and Dan Siegel are trying to say, that the more you practice meditation, the more you practice getting into a state of calm, peacefulness, whatever it might be, then you're more likely to have those kind of states in the future.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's all about the seeds that you water, and it feels like in that way, faith, like mindfulness, it's actually simple, but not easy, right? Like most of it is like, oh yeah, it's just love. It's very simple, but it's not easy. And it's I thank you for bringing up that quote. That that was actually a formative experience that I had in college. It was like I was doing a lot of social justice and peace work, and realized that a lot of the people that I was working with, even though they were working for outer peace, didn't have a lot of inner peace. And so to see those as not excluding one another, to do the outer peace work and the social justice, but to work for inner peace, and that, like Einstein says, you can't change a problem at the same level of consciousness that created it. And
exactly.
So, really we're serving humanity the more we're able to raise our consciousness to those levels of love and compassion. And for me, one quote that's been helpful too, and thinking about that transformation that you mentioned, is one thing that Yogananda said, because he's obviously a formative teacher for me, which was that when you're working on change, it's about 25% our effort, 25% the guru, and 25% the grace, or 50% the grace of God. So that certainly we want to put in 100% of our 25%, but it also, for me, realized, wow, like, just trying to open to that grace, that like, if I think it's all my own ego that's gonna transform myself, like I've talked to many students who are like, I just can't forgive, or whatever it is that they can't do. And sometimes I'm like, well, maybe their prayer is like to ask for the grace to be able to, because sometimes if we're thinking that we're going to do it with our own ego, that can be kind of self-limiting, as opposed to like opening to the grace of Guru or grace of God, and in that transformation process, so that we can be instruments for that love, and not think like, oh, it's me that's loving, as opposed to I'm just tuning into that love that's already there, present in everyone,
right,
and just trying to be a channel for that.
Yeah, And that, setting an intention for that is one of the important steps, it sounds like.
Yeah.
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 Interesting. Yeah. I mean, so I am curious to circle back around to the issue of reincarnation, right?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, because in a way, as someone who also has been very influenced by Buddhism, and Alan Watts and all that, I mean, there seems to be a degree of plausibility to that, right? When we look at the cycles of nature and all that. But I guess maybe it's an area of insecurity for me. It's like, it seems like I feel like a lot of people might balk at that. Like, how can you be a Christian and believe in reincarnation? So, ordained UC pastor, let's hear how how do you justify, right? I'm just curious, honestly, though.
Yeah. No, I mean, to me, it just seems like common sense. In the sense of like, would God just give us one life and then that's it? That's all you got. If the purpose of life is to continue working on perfecting ourselves and perfecting love, like, one lifetime is not a whole lot. I mean, if you think, the whole idiom that, a whole lifetime is like the blink of an eye in God's time. So, and even just the scientific proof. I mean, reading, Yogananda's autobiography or different spiritual traditions and yogis. There's one story in autobiography of a yogi where, one of Yogananda's students that he's teaching with dies, and then he says, before I die, will you promise me to find me in my next body? And anyway, long story short, Yogananda does, and it's so stuff like that. It's like, it feels like that there are a lot of stories out there. It seems like it's beyond just kind of tangential proof. So as someone who like really values kind of the scientific approach and kind of my own investigative and intuitive faculties, it feels like it kind of just makes sense. And that even the early Christian fathers, like Origen, taught that there was reincarnation. So kind of before the church, with Constantine, began to move towards a much more doctrinal, orthodox, like, this is what you can believe and can't believe, like that was actually, a teaching. And, Jesus doesn't really say anything about it. But if you look at, like the scripture where, the well-known scripture where Jesus is saying, like, well, who do you say that I am? And some of them are like, well, some say Elijah or one of the prophets. And he doesn't scold them. He's like, no, reincarnation doesn't exist. Like, well, the only way they would say Elijah or one of the prophets is if they were assuming that he had reincarnated. That Elijah would the prophets reincarnated. So
that's fascinating.
Like that.
Yeah, I'd never really considered that or known about, like you said, it was Origen or someone prior to Origen?
Yeah, Origen. Yeah, one of the early church fathers. Before he was, condemned. At least that teaching was condemned as heresy.
Okay, yeah. Interesting, though. Yeah, I mean, because, right, who knows, unless you had a near-death experience or someone who has experienced dying, right? We're all kind of, in some sense, in uncertainty about that. But that is one of the things, I think, in a way, that reincarnation has going for it is... So let's take it from a purely 100% sort of scientific perspective. You can say pretty much without a shadow of a doubt that the cells and the atoms in your body when you die will, over the course of time, eons of time, probably become part of other living organisms as well. I mean, that's pretty much inevitable, right? The atoms of the universe, they reconfigure themselves, that it's always in a state of flux, and that, as scripture says, right, that things will be, we will not all die, but we will merely change, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's what I loved about Alan Watts is like he wrote a thing about the reality of reincarnation in his Mountain Journal,
Mm.
Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown, and
Mm.
that's a great. And it's very convincing the way he wrote it. But at one point in there, he states, if if uh, if this experience of consciousness can happen to me after a seeming eternity of being asleep or non-existent, then if I can all of a sudden wake up out of this, right, after supposedly billions of years of not existing, what's
Right.
to say that that experience cannot happen to me again, right? If you take your consciousness as this fluke, you know, for you, that's one way to articulate it, right? Is, you know, there was nothing, 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 and then there's this flash of consciousness, a mere blink of an eye, and then you go back to the nothing, nothing, nothing for all eternity, right? The darkness.
Right.
But if there is that one flash, against all probability, right? What's to say that that flash of consciousness called life cannot occur out of the darkness once again, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I'm obviously biased because I don't know if I've shared this experience with you, but you know, I don't want to get too much in the story because it's my mom's story to tell. But when my mom was giving birth to me, she had a near-death experience.
Wow.
And you know, so, you know, like went into the light or God or whatever you call it, and was like, you know, like you can't love me this much with everything that I've done, like, you know. And yet it was just this unconditional love, you know, just undescribable, you know, grace upon grace. And so that's, for me, that's why that agape love is so central, because even from when I was a kid, like that's who God is. Like God and love are synonymous and interchangeable. I just finished reading a book about a UCC pastor who experienced a near-death experience, you know, when he was like 21 years old. It was a pretty intense experience he had, you know, while rock climbing in sub-degree temperatures. This was in like 1980. When he was a college student. It's called the book is called Heaven is Beautiful. But you know, so many people like him and my mom who've experienced those near-death experiences, and you know, might have what's called like a life review, you know, where they go back and look at their life and feel those parts of their life where they hurt other people, and also feel the parts where they helped other people. You know, it's seeing how we're all interconnected. And part of that life review is, as I see it, that we can continue to grow and evolve, and our souls can grow and evolve to be all that God intended us to be. And, you know, and so that then when we choose the next life, okay, what's the next life lesson so that I can continue growing towards, you know, living into the fullness of what I would call the Christ consciousness. And it takes more than one life to get there.
Yeah, right. You know, I mean, you know, in a way that perspective makes a lot of sense, I think. That this life is such a beautiful thing, and that's what it's about. And at the same time, I can understand, though, why people might think, because it's so easy to focus on the suffering. I mean, the suffering is probably at least 50%, if not more, right, of our lives here on Earth, and has been that way from really the beginning, right? That life is this process of struggle and overcoming struggle and dealing with and coping with struggle. So, yeah, I think learning and growing and experiencing is all part of it. But I can see how a lot of people might have that perspective of, how can this be it? Why would we have to go through this multiple times when it's so painful for so many people, you know?
Right.
Which, yeah, gets into the whole theodicy problem, the problem of suffering, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. It's a valid point. And, you know, a lot of people will be like, well, why would God make us go through this more than once?
Yeah.
Once is enough with all this suffering. And you know, and like you said earlier with Alan Watts, like once you change your perspective, like, how can I grow with grace? Because all of us, like, we all have these highs and lows and storms in our life, some more than others. But like, how can I use whatever experiences I've had to continue to grow in love? And again, that's simple but not easy. So not to minimize anybody's suffering, because people have gone through some pretty tough stuff in their lives. But so I totally get that. It's, at the same time, I'd hate for a lot of people, it's just, heaven becomes like an escape. How can I just leave this life and just get to heaven where everything's good?
Right.
And I feel like that kind of escapism, or even some more conservative Christians are like, not so worried about this life, because I'm just trying to convert you to my form of belief so that you can go to heaven. So it becomes a very afterlife focused, life philosophy, as opposed to, at least for me, that holding that reincarnation belief it keeps me grounded in this life too, because I want to get to that place of living in love quicker, because I don't know how many more lifetimes I'm going to get, but I want to live this lifetime to the fullest.
I think that's a really important point you're making, because we talked about, like, one of the things I was thinking about asking you, and I guess I still will at some point, but why then still stay Christian? Like, why still invest in all this if we can identify in different ways, or Buddhism, etc. And you did touch on that, but incarnation is so central to me as a Christian. It's probably the number one reason why I'm still a Christian. It's like I'm inspired by Richard Rohr, who, for him, incarnation is also so central, because that's the whole Christian thing, right? Is God becoming incarnate in the physical world, in this body of flesh, right, and skin and bones, and present in the world with us. And that is kind of a radical idea to me. The union of the spiritual and the material. And what you're saying, that this kind of belief helps you become more invested in this world. And I agree with you. I've met Christians too that are kind of just like, well, just trying to get through this thing till we get to the better part. And I think that's part of why we're having this issue of the climate crisis, right? And global warming is because people are like, well, it doesn't matter anyway. There's some extent to which they're using that belief as an excuse to just say, well, the world's going to come to an end soon anyway. It's almost like they're manifesting that, you know what I mean? And instead of this idea of, okay, God is participating with us, and we are with God participating in that. We're totally at one, sort of going through this life together. And I think, even as you've written before, right, the prayer of Jesus saying, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that it's part of our work to make heaven out of life here on earth, and to be grounded in it, and to find God in the world, as imperfect as it is,
Right. Yeah, I have a similar response to you. That the incarnation is one of the reasons where I feel so called to stay within Christianity. That not only did God become flesh, but I feel like that's the power within Christianity today. Like, I feel like that's why most people are fleeing churches, because they don't see an embodied Christianity.
Yeah.
Like they're like, oh, I like that Jesus, but I don't find, like that Gandhi quote, but I don't see much Jesus in the Christians.
Yeah.
And so the more we can embody that love, which is who Jesus was, what the Christ consciousness is, then that's the power of Christianity. It's like that St. Francis saying that, like, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words.
Right.
That, like, that's our first task, is to embody that love, not, as a preacher or pastor, not just to speak it, so not to just for that kind of good news to be heard, but I think that there's that other quote of, I want to be a sermon seen and not just heard.
Right. So, which is what Thich Nhat Hanh is doing. right? And that's
Yeah.
why,
Yeah.
people are drawn to Buddhism and stuff, because I don't think, to a large extent, let's be real. I mean, you mentioned this earlier. You don't seem to get that as much in the Christian tradition. I think historically, maybe in different times and places, but it's harder to find. And
Right.
I don't know. We can go into the reasons why. Maybe it's kind of, I'm not even necessarily sure, but like we said, maybe Buddhism is more practice oriented and good at really embodying that in a more effective way, and not getting bogged down in tradition, like we said,
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
I think all those are true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what does that look like, I wonder, right? Like, so maybe as we're kind of coming towards the end of the episode, what's the future of the church look like, right? I mean, that's a question I think we're mutually interested in as, as pastors kind of that are probably towards the beginning of our career, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
I know I am.
I think it's going to look different everywhere, because I think it's going to be contextual in every setting. And if we're really trying to follow where the Spirit is leading and where God's calling us, like for example, John Dorhauer wrote a great book called Beyond Resistance: The Institutional Church Meets the Postmodern World, and his last 4 chapters of that book give 4 different examples of different emerging churches, and they're all totally different. Like, they're all doing different things, and so, but none of them look like traditional church. That's the one thing they have in common. So the form, even though they stay true to the essence, the forms are different. And but I think that takes that boldness to be able to go outside of the box of tradition and say, let's do things in a radically different way that may be different, but it's going to be kind of exciting, a little bit scary, but let's keep love at the center of it, and make sure that we continue to stay grounded in God's love and the way of Jesus. And and anyway, but yeah, so there's some kind of foundational stuff there, but it's kind of exciting to really live into that new way of being together, which in a way feels like kind of a return to the early church, where they were meeting in houses, and it wasn't that institution yet that it became under Constantine, and became like all the fancy robes, and kind of soon became an obligation and requirement to go to church. It was like people chose to be there; they were excited to be there, and in some ways it feels like we're returning to that. With churches getting smaller, and people like, you really want to choose to be there, because people are fine just opting out because they don't want to be there, they don't find it life-giving. And so I think in a way returning to that early church.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like a lot of established congregations are afraid or very unwilling to make changes in a lot of cases. Yeah. So right. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think we have to explore sort of new ways of being, but I don't think that so I think it's easy maybe to think, oh, what are we going to come up with that's new and alternative? And there's some element to which, I mean, there are unknowns. What's the future of the church going to look like? But for me, I think part of it has been that it doesn't have to be that complicated, that we can return to the simplicity of it, of what is it that really matters. Like we said, the rummage sale, getting rid of the non-essentials and returning to what's essential. What's essential? I mean, it's really about connecting with one another, being in community with one another, loving one another, and experiencing that spiritual connection to something larger than ourselves. And for us as Christians, I think that means being grounded in the stories and symbols of Christianity, of our ancestors, and being grounded in that, and enjoying fellowship and trying to manifest what that looks like in the world in an incarnated, embodied way, right? To love our neighbors.
Yeah, totally. And in that way, I don't feel a whole lot of anxiety about the, churches decreasing, because I feel like, like with the whole rummage sale metaphor, like there are forms of church that are declining and churches are closing. But if you think about the resurrection, there are new forms that are being born, and they look much different than the old way. But that there's this, God's still up to something in this time, even though it may be hard to see it because we're right in the midst of it.
Right.
But it's kind of exciting when you step back.
Yeah, it's a really optimistic way of looking at it, and yeah, it is. It is kind of exciting to think, okay, well, I mean, this really goes back to one of the main patterns and models with which Christianity operates, which is death and resurrection, right?
Yep.
That we're experiencing a kind of death and transition right now. And what is called, what we're called to do is to some extent to have some faith and trust that after this experience and transition, resurrection awaits us,
Exactly.
Very cool.
Couldn't have said it better.
Great. Well, yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else we wanted to discuss, you think, before we sort of wrap it up?
It feels like it's been a really rich, productive conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really your questions and the back and forth. It's been great. Yeah, a great dialogue.
Yeah, I agree. This was a lot of fun. I think we should probably try to do it again.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Well, thanks so much, Matt, for joining me, for doing this, being part of Second Table. Really appreciate it. It was great talking with you. And,
thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it, Winston.
Keep us posted on the release of your book and Agape Spiritual Community. Do you want to let people know, by any chance? You don't have to, but where they can learn more about you or find more about you, a website or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, www.agapewaltham.org, because that's where we're based in Waltham, Massachusetts. So agapewaltham.org is, if you go to the upcoming events, it has our list of upcoming stuff, and including the meditation thing that's starting next week, and some stuff about me, about our vision. So my email's on there, so people can, if you have any questions, contact me.
Okay.
So,
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks so much again. It was really fun to talk with you, Matt. Till next time.
Thanks, Winston. Likewise.
All right.
Till next time.